Thank you. Welcome. I guess for most of you, this will be the first session of this Davos, so thanks for kicking it off with us. And the topic of today is nature development, nature as a crucial factor in preserving biodiversity for the future. And we all know that while we're here, we are in a world that is competing for attention for geopolitical stress, climate stress, and in that context, we also know that in the bigger picture, biodiversity loss is one of the grave priorities that we need to focus on. So that context is where, and we know it's here. Here we are talking really about how we can accelerate the development of nature and how we can make a concrete step forward to make that possible. And I have with me an eminent group of speakers. I'm just your moderator, Wiebe Dreyer, Rabobank, and I'm honored to be here in this prestigious company. Let me introduce them to you as we dive into the session, and let me try to run that as effectively as I can. We have, and I'm very honored, Elizabeth, that you were with us. I was told I can call you Elizabeth Mrema, and you are the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, but really you are driving an important agenda for the COP later in the year, which we all hope will go down into history as the Paris Agreement for Nature. And so you're driving that preparation, and we're very honored that you're with us. Thank you for being here. We also have Carlos Eduardo Correa, and Carlos is the Minister of the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia. And Colombia, as most of you might know, is really well known for developing and proactive policy making in the area of nature development, and we're honored to have you with us, Your Excellency. And then we have Patrick Auger at the far end, who is the Chairman of the Board of Directors of Bank Lombard Auger & Co. Limited. Thank you for being with us. And we have, last but not least, Kirsten Brathen, who is the CEO of DNB ASA, and DNB, I was told, stands for nothing, but it is a big bank in the past.
It's a name.
It's just a name. Covering both the largest asset manager of Norway, investing in nature. And so I think we have a group representing both the international organizations of organizing an agenda. We have the public sector and we have the private sector. And that is precisely the kind of conversation we're hoping to have this morning. As we kick off, let me just say I'm Wiebe Dreyer, CEO of Rabobank, and when I recall the way Peter Bakker of the WBCSD summarized the SDGs, he said, really, if you want to have a simple summary, it is climate, it is social, and it's biodiversity. And so at the highest level of priority, we really need to care for developing the biodiversity in the world and stopping the biodiversity loss. And that's the context in which we speak. And so let me introduce the first question to you, Elizabeth, so to get us going. And this year, all three Rio conventions are taking place within the 12 months of each other, and they will determine the extent to which the Earth's system will be brought back on course for a better balance. And in this annual meeting in Davos, it's a crucial milestone on the way to the Convention on Biological Diversity, COP15, that will take place later in the year. And we all hope it will be the Paris Agreement of Nature. What is the entry point for business when that is the milestone? What is it? It is the first session, so we're all still tuning in. Thank you. What is the entry point, as you see it, for business to engage in the process? And what is the role of corporate and financial sector action in the rollout and implementation of post-global diversity framework that you will hopefully realize? So this is really a question about your view on what can business do to contribute ahead and to deliver later on. Elizabeth.
First, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Indeed, biodiversity is everything, is the foundation of life. It is the food we eat. It is the air we breathe. It is the water we drink. It is the development we are talking about, socio-economic. It's virtually everything. But whether we'll get the Paris Agreement for nature, that will heavily rely on governments, because it is the government-led process. And I believe that Carlos will assure us that that is the intention and that is what ought to happen. But that will not be enough. and the lessons we have learned over the 30 years of the existence since the establishment of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and 50 years since the establishment of the United Nations Environment Programme, sadly that today we are still talking of biodiversity loss. The reasons which established, the reasons which led to adoption of the convention 30 years ago, today they still remain, in fact, accelerating. So I think that's the first point we all need to ask ourselves. What are we doing wrong? Or what are we doing right? Or what needs to be done that come 30 years from today, and this will be none probably, many of us might not be there, but our children, the young, need to be there, will be there. So I mentioned government-led, but the government are not alone responsible for changing the situation. And this is one of the major lessons we have learned from the previous years, engagement of all stakeholders. Delighted in the recent years that business have become really engaged, which was not the case 10 years ago and previously. And I think this is where we are seeing the main entry point, that the business are forefront, that it is their activities which are also leading to where we are, the biodiversity loss, where scientific evidence is clear that we are losing million species at an unprecedented rate in the history of humankind. 83% of the land is already lost, 85% of wasteland destroyed. I mean, and the figures are scary. But also World Environment Forum tells us that actually there is a business case on nature. 50% of the global GDP dependent on nature. $10.1 trillion accrue per year. To accrue even more, about 395 billion jobs by 2030. So there is a business case in nature. But that business case needs to be sustainable. Because it is that business case which has brought us to where we are. That we are losing species, we are losing agricultural land, habitat defragmented. So that's the main lesson, that the business as usual cannot continue. That has to change. And delighted that the business is coming on board with that realization and now taking measures to manage and assess the risks, the impacts of the dependencies on nature. And what we are looking now from the business is not just to assess the risks, but also there are opportunities. Economic opportunities are clear, as I'm saying. But then we need that to be reported. We need that to be disclosed, to be able to tell we are moving from step A to B to C. Otherwise, then the world doesn't know. We will continue to blame the business while knowing very well that the business is taking measure. I have the privilege to be involved as one of the co-chairs of the task force on nature-related disclosure. This is what we are doing. And delighted that in this task force, that we have the market actually coming up, sitting down, developing a framework for their business, how they can manage the risks, how they can measure that dependence and be able then to disclose. 10 years ago, I'm sure we would not have thought that the business would have been at the forefront to develop a framework which will put a hook on their business. But now they're saying, no, we are ready. We are doing it ourselves for the market, by the market. And I think that is a major development. When we look at the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, the process currently going on being developed, to be adopted at the next conference of the parties, the business, the financial sector is already recognized. Draft Target 15 is calling on business to assess and measure the risks and the impacts of their operations, to be able to move the financial flows from nature negative to nature positive, to also look at harmful subsidies, $500 billion spent each year on harmful subsidies. Can we have these resources being repurposed into nature positive? Okay. And we are seeing actions. So, and this is where we are seeing also the business will come on board, that they have their target in the framework, that they will be able to assess and report, and measure and report, and indicators are equally being developed for that purpose. But this is where we are seeing the business coming in, and delighted the business is getting on board. And we hope this will be further enhanced and strengthened, that the decision-making processes at business level do take into account business, nature.
And Paris is a high bar to meet for nature, and we need it. I'm Dutch, so I apologize for this question. You are driving it to that level. Is business already enough involved in the preparation of that conference?
I will say yes, because I'm comparing with the past. I'm comparing 12 years ago when the H biodiversity targets were developed and adopted, where the business was hardly involved. Now we are seeing a number of platforms by the business, Business for Nature, High Ambition Coalition for Nature. I mean, all these platforms are on board, all helping us to prepare for this framework. And that shows that engagement. And we know the business are calling for ambitious, transformative framework. They will not have done so if they are not ready.
Okay, that's
or
a
getting
comfort.
ready.
So let this be a calling for any remaining bystanders. Carlos, you said I could call you Carlos.
Yeah.
Colombia is a great example of developing nature and having policy that is effective to drive nature development as part of the development of the country. Can you talk a little bit about the most effective policies that you've installed, and then reflect on what you would say countries need to do as they step into this Paris Agreement for nature?
Well, I'm going to take some words from Elizabeth. Now we're talking about a triple crisis: climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. So in Colombia we have two big challenges: to be carbon neutral by 2050 and to be nature positive by 2050. So the most important thing is policy making, because, you know, our government is only for 4 years. So we have many actions that we are working on, but what's going to happen next? So policy making is very important. So in 2020, we update our NDCs, 51% reduction, the emission of the greenhouse emission by 2030. We are working in nature positive, but all those NDCs, so I don't want to, number each policy. I think Colombia now has a roadmap for the next 30 years. We have our NDCs and our carbon neutrality strategy in a law. It's called the Climate Action Law. So in our law, we are talking about zero deforestation by 2030. It's directly related to nature and to biodiversity. Deforestate 1 hectare takes you 1 day. To restore it takes you how much, Elizabeth? 25 years. 25 years. So what are we doing? In the Climate Action Law, we're talking about the High Ambition Coalition. Colombia has to protect the 30% of its territory by 2030. We announced, President Duque announced at COP26 that Colombia is doing it 8 years earlier. So in July, we'll be declaring the 30% of our territory protected. We are talking about clean mobility, to have 600,000 electric vehicles. We are talking about agriculture, 2.5 million hectares in silvopastoral projects. We are talking about restoring more than 1 million hectares by 2030. Now we are planting 180 million trees. We are restoring and planting 1 million corals at the same time, and that's connected. Carbon neutral, it's connected to nature positive. They have to be working together. That's why it's so important, the COP15, that it's taking this year, I hope.
And what is your call on other governments?
And our call to action and the financial sector. Now with that climate action law, we have the green taxonomy. We launched it 2 months ago. We are talking about nature-based solutions for the financial sector. It's so important that you see nature-based solutions as an investment, So my call is to put in the center biodiversity, nature-based solutions in your portfolios, private sector involved in this, as it's a fly. And you know, now we have more than 600 companies that have signed agreement with the government in the road of carbon neutrality and nature positive. So we are working with more than 600 companies in less than a year. We hope there will be 1,000 by July, and then I know all the private sector is going to be working in those objectives, and policy is so important. That's why we signed that bill, the climate action law bill, and we are going to be presenting in July a biodiversity law to the Congress, a nature positive law. So before the government, the term ends in August, we will have one bill approved, signed by the president, that was the climate action law, and now we'll leave in the Congress the nature positive law. And that will guarantee us that everything is, you know, going to be working for the next 30 years.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. And we hope many countries follow your suit. Kirsten, can I turn to you? And I'll go straight with the same question to Patrick after, so you can prepare a view. But here's a lot of talk about the private sector at the cause of the original decline of nature, but also a lever for change. And we're seeing many private sector companies talking about nature and integrating it into their policies. At the same time, many are still saying, well, frankly, it's climate first and then maybe nature later. Or they're saying, frankly, profits still matter in these uncertain times. What are your responses to that, to these critics? And also, what do you see as the biggest roadblocks for actions on the part of private sector?
First of all, I would like to thank the forum for setting this very important topic on the agenda. I think that is particularly one of the elements that will bring us forward in such an important area. And policymakers, government are important, but I also agree very much with what has been said. We need the private sector, the corporate sector, to be a driving force in order to achieve the change that we are looking for. I represent the largest bank in Norway. We have been working on nature and sustainability and energy transition for a long time. We have a long history in key areas such as the maritime industry, shipping, very relevant for nature. We're the largest seafood producer in the world for salmon, very relevant in relation to nature. So these are areas that have been on our agenda for a long time. And I think businesses have been doing positive initiatives, but not in anywhere near the pace that we need it to be. And I think that is what really needs to change now. Our sense is that businesses are aware of the responsibility, certainly the risks that are there, and the need to be a key driving force in the change. And I talk to a lot of businesses every week, and there's no doubt that there is now a consensus and a broad agreement that there is no profitability without sustainability. But it needs to be both. And I think part of the challenge lies in bringing and understanding the risks that we are talking about. We need a better understanding of the risks, and we need to be able to take them down into a micro level into all of the investments in order to increase the pace of investments, because this is going in the right direction, but not at a sufficient pace. We have come further working systematically in energy transition. I think this is the framework that we need to build on, because they are interlinked, nature as well as the energy transition and the path to net zero. We have taken a very clear stance that we see our role and responsibility to be an accelerator. We should help businesses. We should require them to set concrete targets. We scrutinize their transition plans, and we have set clear targets on energy transition to reduce the footprint of our portfolios by partially by 2030 and then fully by 2050. And we are largely reallocating capital over to sustainable investments. So the same framework needs to be applied, we believe, for nature, and we really look forward to the frameworks that are being developed. We need more data and metrics and measurements in order to scale the initiatives.
So you're clearly ahead on this topic, but others are questioning. What are the roadblocks that you've encountered that they will also encounter to get this going?
It's not so much, I believe, that we see, I wouldn't call them roadblocks, but we need to continue to develop data and transparency. We need to continue to look for standards, like TFND will be an important framework, I think, for nature, as it has been for energy transition. We need agreements. We have signed up to the finance of biodiversity that we have followed for the past 2 years in our asset management business. There are now 12 trillion euros that have signed up to this, and many parties who is a driving force in this. And we need, one of my key topics is how do we bring this down to the SMEs? It's easy when you ask the large corporates of this world. They have their transition plan on energy. I think they will get there also on nature. And we see decision-making starting to happen. For an SME that has limited resources, this is a huge part of the economy, a huge part of the employment and social welfare in countries. And we in the finance industry need to help them. This is also a great business idea, I think, for startups. How do you help and make it efficient for SMEs to understand their course of action? And maybe lastly, I think we need to accept that there will be some pain in the process. The pace that we need will open up for missteps. It will open up for shortages on energy. It will create inflationary pressures, and maybe we need to start talking about that pain is actually worth it, because if we don't, there's no business case, there's no economy, there's no welfare. But so far, I think we have been a little bit careful actually talking about the pain in the short term that is likely to come from this very important change.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Let me turn to Patrick. You are also known for making clear steps in this area. Can you talk a little bit about what you have done, but also what you see as the barriers that private sector typically encounters on this topic?
Yes, thank you very much. I think a lot of things have been just said to set the stage. I think sustainability in general, which is an area and a concept that we've been looking at for the last 30 years in particular, has included, of course, nature at the heart of its consideration. And today we sort of have to make sure that climate, nature, and social issues do go together rather than are analyzed separately and create separate frameworks. So I very much agree with the idea that we should capitalize, if I may use the term here, on the good things that have been done already on the climate side. By the way, extremely complex issues that took years and years and thousands of talented scientists to come up with a very simple metrics, which is 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius max. I think we dearly need something similar for nature. And I think Elisabeth is working on it. Thank you very much, and we look forward to the fall for having perhaps more clarity on that. But the fact is that with these simple metrics, which are defined after a lot of complex analysis, the world is going to focus even faster. As Kirsten was saying, it's a question of momentum, and it's a question of pace. We'll focus faster on the transformation of the capital allocation or the credit into the right directions. And that's what we have experienced in the recent few years, i.e., I think in general, nature, if you take that aspect, has been recognized as a productive asset. And if it is the case, the question is, how do you protect nature as you would protect any asset? And how do you harness nature in a way that will make it more efficient than perhaps the more traditional industrial ways to produce? And I think this is where, the work that we're doing in allocating capital is becoming also important. If we believe that sustainable or sustainability is going to be completely transformative for most of the activities, then we have to put it at the center of capital allocation or of credit activities, because otherwise we wouldn't do our fiduciary, we wouldn't apply our fiduciary duty correctly. And I think the world has understood that. What is yet to be done is, of course, to make sure that we develop the right, not only metrics, but also the right ways to encourage the collaboration between what is the responsibility of the state or the government and what is the responsibility of the corporate and finally the financial sector. One of the misconceptions really that starts to be too often discussed is the fact that the financial sector will be the solution. Actually, the financial sector will hope to have the best solution, because otherwise, again, it will not reach the good results, i.e. the positive returns that it expects to do from those productive assets. But in order to do that, you have to have intervention at the right place at the right time of the government policies. I hate to say it, but this comes from the fact that we are running into some market failures in this respect, and that's why, for once, I think the stars are aligned, because the financial sector recognizes that failure, the corporate sector recognizes the potential of the nature-based solutions, and the governments, of course, are pushed in these directions because of all the impacts, including social impacts, that not solving those issues will create. So I think bridging the gaps between these different areas will really probably contribute to speeding up the process.
Can I maybe touch one stop more before we open the floor for a general discussion? As investors, and I represent a bank, and we also do a lend which is tied to biodiversity gain, so you get a discount on the loan if you have measurable progress in biodiversity gain. That's just a small step in tying biodiversity gains to a financial instrument of an investor or a financier. What do you see more that the sector as a whole of investors can do to direct the private sector more to this subject? And maybe either Kirsten or Patrick.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of things we can do. I think we have to start with the right priorities, and I think that if we're looking at not only the returns perspective that I was just mentioning, but also at the risks that are implied, starting with the risk is probably the best way to look at it. And if you take the risk, I think nature is probably one of the, I hate to say, but the cheapest or the most cost-effective way to treat climate-related issues. And if we were to define one priority the private sector could lead, it's probably to find the solutions, the frameworks, the vehicles that will encourage capital to flow into some of those nature-based solutions that will contribute to recapture carbon, for instance, and will make projects available for the next generation of financial instruments, such as, for instance, the voluntary carbon certificate market, which will tremendously improve the situations once the framework has been defined.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Kirsten?
No, I think sustainability-linked loans, that we like to call them, we certainly see a substantial increase. I think it's an important tool, but still just one tool. And I think one of the things that we've done for energy transition is that we've stated that we will provide 1,500 billion kroner for sustainable investments towards 2030. So that's another driver for reallocating capital. It's the size of our total balance sheet today, so it's quite substantial. I think furthermore, it's the cooperation with the businesses, both on the investment side and on the bank side. Yes, we do have certain areas of exclusion, businesses that we won't do if you don't have a transition plan, if you have no recognition of your of the consequences of your activity. You will have to find different partners than us. But primarily, we've been focused on our important role to impact, because we need to learn together. So it's about upping the demands. You start with a transition plan. Our asset management company has issued a letter of expectations on the biodiversity to companies that they invest in. We use our voice in general assemblies to vote on transition plans. And I think lastly, probably the most important thing that we will become better at is assessing risk. And I think more so than making sustainable investments cheaper, we're probably going in the direction of making
the others more
detrimental activities so much more expensive. And this is difficult. We're at the starting point of really understanding that, and I hope we will become much better at it before we actually experience more of the dire consequences of what's going on.
Thank you. Elizabeth, let me turn to you for a difficult part of this conversation, which is Paris had it easy, forgive me for saying this, because climate can be directly related to CO2 emissions, and we have a framework and you can measure it and you can tie it, and for investors and private sector it's easy. When you measure something you can act. Nature is more difficult. What is it that is required, and can this be done in making this more quantifiable so that it becomes a compass to steer on?
We know literally everybody is asking what is the 1.5 degrees for
equivalent
nature.
for nature.
Equivalent for nature. But I think we need to understand nature is more complex, unlike climate. And I don't think it will be easier to quantify it numerically as expected, especially when we say nature is everything. So is it 1.5 for water, for air, for food? I mean, we have to understand that nature is complex, and with that complexity, that it might be difficult to have that numerical number. But what I think is important, which she had alluded, is really to get the data and the metrics and the transparency needed for reporting for different aspects of nature, as opposed to one number which covers all complex web of nature.
And gross simplification, that doesn't help either.
Yeah.
No, okay. Let me see whether there are specific questions in the room that, there you go, front row. Can you stand up and maybe say your front row first and then the second row? Thank you. Say your name and then pose the question to the person you would like to pose the question to.
Sure. My name is Slava Solanica. I'm CEO and co-founder of Mighty Buildings. We 3D print buildings, and we're trying to do it in a sustainable way. So we just discovered recently that how we use composite materials, right? So it's advanced composite materials, which are partially using fossil petrochemicals and stuff. But we recently discovered you can re-engineer this material to use renewables, right? So like with companies like Solugen and others who are working on the CRISPR, genetically modified enzymes. So this whole like change is happening. And the construction is about 20% of carbon footprint globally. So what I sort of thought and start thinking, there are ways to sort of rethink material supply chain on many industries to use more and more renewables and sort of alternative supply. Do you believe, and of course it will directly impact nature as well, because you'll change the way you use natural resources, the way you think about natural resources. And let me address this question. So I think like the best would be probably MREMA. So do you think like there are ways to think about like material supply chain of many industries from perspective of utilizing natural resources and sort of trying to reshape the way industries use natural resources?
Elizabeth.
I think that's the way to go. What we are lacking currently is a lot of efforts are taking place at different angles, different places, but the world doesn't know. And the need to upscale those positive experiences is what is needed. Because virtually all businesses are learning to shift their operations into nature positive operations. But where they are succeeding, how is that upscale? How are those being shared for others to see and know.
Yeah, so it is a lever and it's a direction. I'm going to you first, then to the front row, then to the back, and then I might run into trouble in time, but I will try to get to you too.
Hi,
Thank you.
my name is Darsono Hartono. I'm actually from Indonesia. 15 years ago, I started a nature-based solution project in Central Kalimantan. The world now is the world's largest nature-based solution project, supplying about 7 million tons of carbon credit every year. It's been a challenging experience for myself as an entrepreneur.
Congratulations.
But the problem is we still need, they need to be more of us, right, in terms of doing this. I mean, Patrick, you mentioned all this nature-based, but unfortunately, this is not the product that is so easily understood. These are the product that is not tangible. Right? Nature is not tangible. When you talk about nature positive, while we can show it in our project, the benefit of nature, working with communities and all. My question is, when are we going to realize what we do is important? Well, there is a disconnect of market. Looking at carbon credit itself is something that they're scared of because of the headline news that you see. When is the time that we realize that what we do, like you mentioned nature, is complementing what the world is? Because we're still stuck when some of the NGOs still believe that, no, that's hot air that you're selling and all, right? But how are we going to solve that problem?
And who do you want to answer this question?
Maybe I can ask Elizabeth or maybe Patrick from a financial side and from a policy side.
Let's start with Patrick. Otherwise, I'm guessing that
Thank
you
you
will
very
get more
much.
questions, Elizabeth.
It's a great question actually, and I frankly think that you know there's a big misconception that can be probably treated by the financial, but let's say the private sector in general, that many of the solutions you're alluding to are basically associated with a willingness to sell better, whereas actually what you just said is willingness to do better, not necessarily to sell better. It's exactly the same thing as whenever you invest capital in general, you will take some hypothesis on what are the major areas that you want to take care about into the portfolios. Today it's inflation, tomorrow it's something else. We believe that sustainability and nature-based solutions should be at the core of a portfolio and a capital allocation process. So it's not an issue of selling better, it's an issue of doing better our job. And I think that is what we have to explain better. So you ask, when are we going to make it understood that what is being done is already good? And whether it's enough, it's another question. I think it's when we are going to be able to just explain what I just said in a better way to the NGOs, to civil society, to everyone, to the politicians. So that's upon us that I'm looking at, and to have a better narrative about why are we reallocating capital.
Okay.
We're not reallocating capital to sell better, and this is where the criticism are coming from.
Yeah, I'm going to be a little bit rude because we want to cover a couple of bases. Kirsten, you said you want to...
I just had to throw a completely different element into there. I would like just a very brief comment on diversity and the importance of diversity. We're working a lot on that. We've done a lot on gender. Now we're moving on. The growing generations, they have different aspects on this. To promote diversity and work for diversity, to have different mindsets and different competence involved in these discussions, I think that's also one of the very key areas.
Okay. I'm going to go to the back of the room and then to the and then I come to you. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. I'm Thierry Madret.
And can you make it succinct?
Yeah, very succinct. Thierry Madret from the Multi-Barometer in France. I'd like to ask everybody on the panel whether you believe that social activism amongst the young generation will push forward the adoption of nature-based solutions.
Thank you. That's a very succinct question. I'm going to go to you, Carlos.
Yeah, you were talking about social activism.
Social activism.
Well, you know, I love activism, and I think it's necessary for people, for countries. But I think that us as government has a responsibility on education.
Awareness.
Activism is fine, but we need to be better in education at schools, at the private sector, and make young people, well, and old people too, because activism is both, to understand what's the purpose of their activism. It's not only just, to go to the streets and say no to everything. No. No And yes, and we have to be pro-positive. You know, I work in Colombia with a lot of young people. We launched an environmental national school last year called Savia. So we are working now with more than 5,000 youngsters in all the regions, and we are doing so fine. And I tell them every day, you can be an activist, but with conscience. You need to realize what we can do and how can we do it, and how long time is going to take us. So I really like it. I would like to be one, but now I'm minister.
You're sounding like one.
Be on the street, just doing things, but I love it. I love it. But the big responsibility that we have as a government is education. Bring back education to schools.
Thank you.
It's the matter. Yeah.
And I consider you a social activist in this response. Very good, very well done. Front row, thank you. And again, I plea on, and I apologize, this has to be the last question in view of time of the session.
I hope this will end on an optimistic note. I think we've got some wicked new technologies to bring to bear on some of these challenges, especially on the measurement side. My company, we have 200 satellites that image the whole Earth every day, and we can actually tell species type and on the floor level and tree level. There's a lot of sensors that people are doing with their smartphones, ground sensors and things. And I think they can help us scale and help measure these challenges, because obviously MBR is an important part of this. How do we ensure that we leverage that? And it's mainly a question for you, Elizabeth. How do we ensure we leverage this, especially because traditionally it's been a long process for bringing new sorts of data into the official measurement process, but now we've got these wicked new tools. How do we bring them in more agilely? Because I think they enable us to scale quickly if we could.
Thank you. Elizabeth.
I think my simple answer will go back to education awareness. We know there's still a misconception between business and other stakeholders, the NGOs, the indigenous peoples, local communities. There is the homework of building trust, particularly on some of these stakeholders, to move them from the business is now moving to sustainability. It's not the business of a decade ago. There's that bridge which needs to be jumped by the business. And most of the criticism you will hear, particularly from local communities, NGOs, is that misconception. So I think, yeah, education awareness becomes key. And as we do that, to upscale these new developments.
Okay. Thank you. You get
2 seconds. A willingness to agree on common standards, I think, is extremely important.
as a combination with technology.
As a also from policymakers to dare take that step and agree across regions, across countries on standards. It is making choices, but with the space we need to dare making those choices and build quality over time.
I have one, just the obligation to use the available data.
Yeah.
Yeah. In that sense, I'm now going to turn to you, Carlos, for the final thought of one sentence.
Just, I agree with you. I think data, technology, transparency that you were talking about just now.
Transferring it. Transferring the technology.
Yeah, and that's it. And I still, you know, in the education issue that it's so important, not only for activism, only for the private sector, only for the public, and each of us. Yeah.
Thank you. Now, given the crucial and central role that you're playing in the run-up to the Paris for Nature, Elizabeth, I'm going to give you the final word to close this session. This is actually gearing up to be an important year for a real step forward, where there is private sector action, there is real examples of governments taking steps, there's technology development, there's a sense of momentum. What is it that you want to bring to a close on this session?
Transformation, ambitious, aim high, and action yesterday, not tomorrow.
Thank you. We have much sympathy for your task, and we look forward to the fall. Thank you very much for attending this session.
Thank you.
Well done.
Action yesterday.
Thank you.
I like that. Yesterday.